esplêndido, sem freio, sem esporas, sem rédea. Partamos envolados do vinho para um seu mágico e divino. Como dois anjos que calentura emplacável tutura no azul cristal de manhã. Sigamos a miragem distante, mansamente balançados sobre a asa do turbilhão inteligente, num delírio paralelo, minha irmã, voando olhos nos olhos, fugiremos sem descanso nem tréguas para o paraíso dos meus sonhos. Como dois anjos que calentura implacável tortura no azul cristal da manhã. Sigamos a miragem distante, mansamente balançados sobre a asa do turbilhão inteligente, num delírio paralelo, minha irmã, voando olhos nos olhos, fugiremos sem descanso nem tréguas para o paraíso dos meus sonhos.
Thank you, Jessica and Lewis. Our reading this morning is from the book of Revelation, and it begins at chapter 21, at verse 10, and then we move to chapter 22 and we read verse 1 through 5. And in the Spirit, he carried me away to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city of Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Nothing accursed will be found there anymore, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And there will be no more night. They need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. This is the witness of the early church. Herein lies wisdom. So, a question we've been contemplating during this season of Easter: what helps us to flourish in our lives as human beings? What is it that helps you to flourish, no matter your age or your stage of life? If you've been attending Rosedale United Church this past year, you've heard us describe ourselves at the start of every service as a center for human flourishing. This is what we're all about, we say now. This is our why, so to speak, to support human flourishing in our city and beyond. Back in 2021, around this time last year, actually, we were trying to re-articulate our sense of purpose as a Christian church in the 21st century. And we spent a lot of time listening to you, our members, and also to folks out in the neighborhood about what they got, what you get from being a part of this church. And we heard three things. This church, this congregation, gives people a chance to be a part of a community. And not just any community, but a community that is conscious of the vulnerable among us. And this church, people told us, you told us, this congregation shows compassion at the deepest moments of our lives, when a baby is born, or when someone close to us dies, or when we're going through a challenging time, an illness, a divorce, a transition. Compassion is here. And this church, people told us, encouraged them to contribute, to try to make our city and our world more humane and more generous and more just and more kind and more loving. So we tried to sum up all this good stuff that church gives, community and compassion and a sense of contribution. We tried to sum up the purpose of this church in one word. And the word that we landed on was flourishing. By connecting us to community and to the divine, and connecting us to compassion and to a means to contribute to others, this church helps people to flourish. And not just our membership, but our neighbors. As a Christian church, our purpose is to support the flourishing of all people in our city, people who don't have a home, people who don't have enough food, our elders, our young people, newcomers to Canada, refugees, people who are incarcerated, people who are sick, people who are healing. And we know that flourishing is a trendy word right now, but when you think about it, that's always what Christian spiritual practices and Christian communities have been about, for the last 2,000 years. Consider the stories of the Hebrew and Greek Testaments, our scriptures. Think of the Exodus story, Moses' liberation of the people of Israel from bondage in Egypt to freedom in a new land. This is a story about human flourishing. Think of the lament and heartache and longing expressed by prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, the poetry they wrote while they were in exile, and how they wrote to help people remember their stories and to remember who they were and to remember their calling. This is poetry about human flourishing. And when you think about it, flourishing was what Jesus was all about in his time on earth. Remember what he said in his very first sermon. He was quoting Isaiah. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. And he sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind and to set free those who are oppressed." And there are so many stories of Jesus healing people who were paralyzed in their lives, people who were outcast, people who were broken, people who were despised. Christian communities have always been about supporting human flourishing. And the kind of flourishing we support isn't about helping people to be the best or to have the most or to get on top or to get the biggest paycheck, all signs of flourishing in our contemporary culture. We're not about that. We're not about helping people create the perfect physical appearance, and flourishing here doesn't depend on your age or your ability or your status. We're not about helping people become the most popular. And during this season of Easter, we've been trying to expand and define what we mean by how our Christian spiritual tradition supports human flourishing. And here's some of what we've come up with so far, and I think this is just the beginning of our list. Right after Easter, we had a visit from a prominent environmentalist, and we talked about how our spiritual tradition teaches us that human flourishing can't be separated from the planet's flourishing. And then we talked about how we're supported by our conviction that the risen Christ lives and is present to us, especially through other people. And on Mother's Day, Catherine Morrow and Mariana Bell talked about how the music we encounter here supports flourishing by connecting us with truth and beauty and helping us to process our emotions. And last week, Professor Alice McLaughlin talked about how spiritual traditions connect us with universal virtues that help us to flourish by calling out the best in us as we engage with others. Which brings me to today and John's vision from the book of Revelation. And here is something more that we're going to add to this list of how our Christian tradition and our practice help support human flourishing. Just a show of hands, how many of you have heard about the book of Revelation, number one? Okay, quite a few, right. How many of you have heard good things about the book of Revelation? How many of you associate positivity with the book of Revelation? Like no one, right? You know, when we took this up on Monday at Bible study and I said, okay, group, we're looking at the book of Revelation this week, the response was, oh no. It has a lot of negative connotations. And that's because it's a fantastical vision of the end of the world. It's poetic and it's full of intense visuals. And a lot of people have tried to use this book to predict an exact end date to the end of the world, and it's been misused. The thing is, Revelation is not meant to be read literally. Its author knows no more about the end of the world than we do. John's book, and this is not John who wrote the Gospel of John, this is someone called John of Patmos. John's book is a powerful act of imagination. When you read it, it's hard to see how you could take this any other way than just pure imagination. I mean, it opens with John being whisked through an open door into heaven to look down upon the end times on earth, and he's sitting up there in the company of God and Jesus, who, by the way, is literally depicted as a slaughtered lamb with 7 horns coming out of his head. And that crew is accompanied by 4 strange creatures, one like a lion, one like an ox, one like a beast with a human face, one like an eagle, and all of them covered in hundreds of eyes and 6 pairs of wings each. I mean, this is totally and completely fantastical. And then the author John watches as humans are held accountable for how they've lived during their time on earth, and each person is repaid for what he or she has done. And he watches as hail and fire mixed with blood rain down on the earth to usher in a new beginning, and mountain-sized balls of fire are thrown into the ocean. And he watches as the figure of Satan, the accuser who has been leading humanity astray, is captured and trapped, and the forces of evil are vanquished, and the forces of goodness and justice and kindness triumph. And at the end, the humans who have struggled against all odds and in all circumstances to be just and to do kindness and to love mercy are ushered into this glorious city that you heard me read about, where the forces of darkness are no more. It's an incredible work of imagination. This is a really specific literary genre that John was writing in called an apocalypse, which is a Greek word that sounds super scary, but it just means unveiling or revelation. And apocalypses are often fantastical works about an imminent future that reveals to us in the here and now what's important and what we should be focusing on. And there's a long tradition of apocalyptic writing in the Hebrew and Greek Testaments, and they're usually written by people whose present life experiences are really wanting. People who write apocalypses are people who long for God to intervene, to thwart all that is wrong in our world, and to reset the world to right. And this describes John perfectly. He's writing from exile. He's been banished to this desolate island, this desolate Greek island called Patmos, and he's under house arrest because of his Christian beliefs. And yeah, so that's Revelation. It's a totally weird, fantastical book. And I got to thinking, is it that weird? Don't all of us, when we're going through hard times and challenges, use our imaginations positively to try to help us through? And I thought, I actually have an example that helped me relate to John. When I was in grade 8, I went to summer camp one summer, and for whatever reason, I just did not connect with any of the other kids at this camp. I did not have any friends, didn't have any friends in my tent group, didn't have any friends anywhere in the whole camp, and people were making fun of me and talking behind my back and leaving me out of activities, and it was horrific. And it's horrific when you're at camp and you realize you have, X many days until you can get back home, right? And it's agony. And how I coped, I realized, was exactly the same way John coped with his exile experience. I used my imagination. I imagined the happiest place on earth for me, which was my grandma and grandpa's place on Lake Okanagan. I've talked about it many times with you here. And I used my imagination powerfully. Like, I conjured the sound of the lake and the feeling of the sun on my body and the taste of the fruit in my grandma's garden. And at a time when I wasn't connecting with anyone, I would conjure my family members and people who were happy to see me and people who loved me. And my imagination actually got me through that time. That was really the only thing that got me through that horrible summer camp experience that I still cringe about when I think about now. We tend to denigrate imagination as just made up, not true. But the witness of our Christian spiritual tradition is that our imaginations are a powerful gift, a tool to help us remember what is ultimate. Our spiritual tradition would say that our imaginations help us to reconnect with our core truths, to give us strength and resilience. Imagination actually helps us to flourish, especially under difficult experiences and in difficult circumstances. So I found myself reevaluating the book of Revelation as I reread it in preparation today and appreciating this imaginative text in a way that I never have before. And I just want to close with 3 core beliefs or convictions that I see the author, John, being affirmed in, being strengthened by the gift of his imagination in this act of writing Revelation, insights and convictions that came to him that we too can keep close and remember for ourselves in troubling and challenging times. First conviction: John's powerful imagination affirmed for him that God's home is here with us on earth. The earth is God's artistic canvas. God is always creating. See, I am making all things new, God says in John's Revelation. And to be affirmed in this ourselves, we might look back at our own lives. Consider our moments of deepest failure, our most broken moments, and how these were also likely, with time, moments of profound learning and wisdom and possibly eventually growth. God has created and is creating even in us. Second conviction affirmed for John by the power of his imagination. Our actions matter. Exiled to an island in the middle of nowhere, banished, his life and his reputation in ruins, John could have proclaimed the opposite, that nothing matters. Why bother? Instead, he wrote Revelation. And he wrote this: I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books, he writes. What we do here, our days and our time and our talents and how we spend them, have tremendous power and potential to enhance life. John's revelation reminded him of this, that he had power. Even when he was at his least powerful, reading and hearing his words, we get that same reminder ourselves and a chance to reorient. Imagination helped John to remember and to recommit. Final conviction. Imagination helps us to remember our goals, where we want to get to. It keeps the ultimate vision in mind. For John, that was a new Jerusalem, a new city, a new world, a new way to relate to each other as humans, a world where everyone flourishes. And we heard his imaginative description of that city, intersected by the river of the water of life, and on each side of it, the tree of life. When it comes to human flourishing, the tradition of our Christian faith has all kinds of notions to add to the conversation, and today we add the power of imagination. So I invite us to consider our imaginations as divine gifts to help us remember what is ultimate and to give us strength and resilience. Our faith teaches that imagination helps us flourish, especially in extraordinary times. Amen.